and today we're building the Mini Crack Pitts.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the things I use for building planes. We'll start over here. I've got batteries. I use them for folding over and laying down wings. Measuring devices, having a accurate way to measure the tiny things is really important. So tape measure, square, making sure everything's square. Great, really important on that one. For using on heat shrink, anytime I need to do some hot glue, I've got that available. I also have all of my adhesives here, all sorts of super glues, and my favorite is the foam tack. Always have a backup foam tack. Then we've got some tape, some pins for doing pinning, parchment paper for putting cyanoacrylate on. Gotta have some of that for sanding. Basically, I use this one for everything. Just a pokey tool, a pin vise for doing very small holes in things. I have my Crack Series Pro power pack ready to go. I've got my controller here with a model already programmed in. I have my precision pliers and my precision screwdriver. It's really good to have a set of these that is complete. Being able to install the O-rings is also awesome because they're notoriously hard to deal with. Some backup paper towels, and I use the manual to help me through the build.
Okay, everybody, let's get into the Mini Crack Pitts build. First thing we're going to have is our manual. I'm going to be referencing that off to the side so you don't have to see me flipping through it all the time. But we're going to be taking out everything that needs to get folded over. So that's going to be our elevator, our rudder, and our ailerons on both wings. While those are loosening up, we are going to be binding our receiver and verifying our servos are centered, and then calibrating our ESC. So I have a bind plug installed. We plug it in. I've got a blinking light on the receiver saying it's ready to be bound. So I'm going to go into my model settings, and I need to make sure that the ID is unique. It looks like this one's not, so I'll have to change it. Okay, now it's changed, and now I can click bind. This procedure is going to be a little different on every transmitter, but I love the Radiomaster TX16S. You can get yours from Twisted Hobbies. Sounds like it went through a standard startup sound. That means everything worked. I can take off the bind plug. And now what we want to do is calibrate our ESC. To do that, I'm going to bring my throttle all the way up. And then I'm going to plug it in. And you'll hear a series of 2 beeps. I think there's like 4 of them. And then you can bring your throttle all the way down, and then a standard startup sound will happen after that. Okay, everything looks great. I'm going to go ahead and put servo horns on this, so once I turn on the transmitter, that zeroes out all of your servos, so I don't have to use one of those little servo centering tools. I've never had good luck with those. So now all my servos are centered. This is also a good time to check the direction of rotation on the motor, but you don't have to do it now. You can do it once it's all on the plane. Now that my ailerons have been folded over for about an hour, I'm going to start on the wing spars. I'll also do the interplane struts that go between the sets of wings. While we're doing it, I'm going to get some parchment paper out, because every time you glue, you should be gluing on top of that parchment paper so you don't glue your stuff down onto your table. So with the elevator, you need to cut open that space all the way, and same thing on the wings. That slot needs to be cut all the way open. And you should be able to open it the entire length of the wing with just a little bit left at each edge. Now when we do these wing spars, we're going to be stacking the spars on top of each other. I glued mine in one on top of the other and just did them one at a time, but you also have the option to sort of spot glue them together and make it just a wider spar and then glue it all in at one time. So there's the first spar, and then there is the second spar. So you want to make sure they're not overlapping, but that they are actually stacked all the way. And I didn't have too much of a problem with that. Keep it nice and flat while it's drying. I used foam tack on these. You could probably use some CA glue, but I like the foam tack for something that you're kind of wiggling stuff around a little bit to get it into place. So putting in that second spar and pushing them together. I really like the foam tack because you can put some glue into a joint and then come back a little later and push it together and tighten it up, and it will continue to tighten. It stays kind of pliable, but it gets tackier and tackier. So cut the slot on the elevator and put its spar in, and then same thing with the interplane struts. These were coming apart just a little bit, so I wanted to pin them together. So I just did that on top of a little piece of foam board. While these are all drying, put those off to the side and then start work on the fuselage. So I got the canopy installed, and now I'm going to start on all of my control horns. So when I take off these little pieces, I then sand them up to get rid of all the little burrs. You probably don't need to, because so many of the times these are going to be inside of the joint that you're gluing it into, but I do like to scuff up the edges as well, because that makes it so the glue can adhere a little bit better. So we've got all those done. Now we're going to work on our gang horns. And you get those into place. Just make sure you're not getting any glue inside of the little circular piece. I used a square to make sure it was flush. And then when we're doing the elevator onto the fuselage, I just wanted to make sure that these were square. So I measure from the tip of the elevator to the tip of the plane and make sure it's the same on both sides. Taking out all the pieces in between, and we're going to do the same thing and then go ahead and cut this down the middle. Dry fit it to make sure everything fits right. You don't need to do any adjusting, and we're going to go ahead and glue the lower fuselage onto it. Make sure that you are gluing it to the bottom of the plane, not the top. And then I'm going to use my square to keep everything nice and square. I'm also sighting down the length of it from the edge of the table, looking towards it to make sure it's not twisting or anything. You don't want your plane flying all crazy when you don't want it to. Now we're putting in the aileron horns. Those only go on the lower wing. And now we're going to cut apart the pants and side force generators. We're not going to be installing these right now, but I got excited and wanted to cut them out, trim them up. Okay, now we're on to the servo for the ailerons. There's a little differential horn. This horn faces the front of the plane, a little crescent shape. The horns go forward. And with this, I had to sand this a little bit to get it to fit onto my servo horn. So I just rolled up a piece of sandpaper and did that. And then we're gonna attach it with some glue. I used foam tack on this. You could use CA glue. We don't have to do any other reinforcement. I haven't had any problems with this coming off or anything. Okay, here are the end links that go into the other servo horns. And we just push those through. I have a friend that showed me a cool way to get those on. I'll show that on the next ones that we're doing. So I'm getting all my stuff set up for the servo, so that way I can get it mounted. Make sure it's all the way in and flush. servos for the elevator and rudder. You have to cut them open just a little bit. And then we're going to put on the servo horns and then dry fit the upper fuselage. Using foam tack all along that. And everything gets pushed together. Again, just checking for square, and then we can set it aside. I always come back and push it together a few times just to make sure I don't have any gaps in there. We're going to glue on our rudder. And then the next thing that we're going to be putting together is the stiffeners for the fuselage that go all the way between the wings inside of the vertical fuselage. We go at a little angle at the front and back. And we're going to stack these as well, just like we stacked the spars in the wings. You got a little bit of glue to cut through. And I dry fit it, make sure everything looks good. Give it a little bit extra room if you need to. And then once the dry fit's done, we're going to add some glue into the joint and get those stiffeners in place. I'm using the screwdriver to push it in so it's flush. And then we're going to work on our plywood doublers. So we cut those out. Oh, also the little wheels as well. And this is where we install the aileron servo. But first we need to install the quick links. A good buddy of mine gave me a pro tip on this, and if you drill a hole in a piece of wood and then push the end link down through the clip into the hole, then these are really easy to put on and you don't have to fuss with them quite so much. Shout out to Aaron for that tip. Then you attach your differential horn facing forward, and then I put in those doublers, little plywood doublers, and then attach the bottom wing. I would put in a little extra glue right up in front of that servo because that tends to be an area that gets a little stress on those unplanned landings. Now we're ready for the inner plane struts. Remember, they get tipped forward towards the front of the plane. And then we're going to put the plywood doublers onto that top portion of the fuselage. And I got impatient here and put the top wing on before those fully dried. I should have waited. But it wasn't too big a deal. It pushed them down a little bit, but they're still glued in. So I got mine all glued together there. So both wings now installed. And now we're gonna work on the landing gear. You probably don't actually need landing gear for this plane because you're not taking off with it or anything, but I like it for orientation. It just looks cool, and it does provide a little bit of cushion when you do flop it into the ground. We're also going to be putting in our rudder horn and our elevator horn. Remember, dry fit these first. I didn't dry fit that one first. I had to take it out and get glue all over my X-Acto blade, and then I needed to replace my X-Acto blade. Now moving on to the motor mount. I did scuff it up with some sandpaper off camera, and it's pretty easy to get on there straight. While the plane's upside down, it's a good time to glue on our tail skid, and then we'll work on the rest of the landing gear. So I cut those at an angle to match the angle of the legs. and then you cut them again to match the plywood circular pieces. Apply some glue, and then we'll put the pants on outside of that. I would have pushed those through a little bit more if I did it again, but they've held up pretty well. Now we're working on the side force generators. These line up with the interplane struts. So just make sure you get it aligned. And there's 2 of them per wing. And they're different on the top and bottom, so you won't mess it up, because they only fit in one way. Now we're working on push rods. We got push rods for ailerons. We've got gang rods, and also the push rods for the elevator and rudder as well. I assemble all of these with their heat shrink. And since I'm going to be gluing, I always use that parchment underneath it. Watch that you don't get too much heat on those, because you'll melt the plastic. And then really make sure that you don't get any glue inside of the pin. So I have a little paper towel to wick up any CA glue that goes where it shouldn't. And then I hit each of these with kicker. And then we're ready to install them. So we're going to start with the aileron servos, and I just pinch those together. Once it's aligned, it pinches right through. The key is it has to be aligned. So I do that on each side. And then I'm going to tighten down those push rods. Sorry, the wing is blocking the view there. Then I'm working on the gang horns. And again with these, as long as they're aligned, then you can pinch them right together. It takes a little bit of patience, and also these offset needle nose pliers do come in pretty handy. I'm sorry the plane is blocking the way here, but make sure your ailerons are parallel, and then you're gonna cut the end just shy of the control horn, and then you're gonna attach the snap link. Once it's the right length and in the right position, you see I use that little piece of carbon fiber to put like half a drop of glue into there. Again, you don't want to get that glue into the snap link, otherwise it won't snap. A little bit of a twisting motion sometimes gets those sent home, but patience is the big thing. I put a little more glue on that gang rod control horn, and then I use a piece of metal to keep it from melting. I heated up that heat shrink. Now we're ready for the push rods on the rudder and the elevator. And before you snap in that little snap link like I did on both of those, I would run it through the end link on the servo horn. Now I'm attaching the standoffs for the push rod, and I just use a little bit of foam tack on each of those. And then I had to pull that off before I snapped it back in to adjust that. That one I was able to bend a little, but you don't want to break one of those. So I got all the standoffs in the right place. Just make sure they're not binding up. If they're twisted, then it'll bind up a little bit. So make sure they're all moving freely and guiding appropriately. And then I cut off all the push rods, about a 1/4 inch, and I also touch a little bit of CA glue to the end of those. Now we're ready to install the motor. And this is about the end of the plane. The one thing I didn't get was me installing the propeller. It's pretty straightforward though. And here I am running the ESC and the wires. I always put my electronics on the left side and my battery on the right side. Here I'm putting in the receiver. And I did a permanent glue in place on these. Okay, the next thing I added was some Velcro to hold the battery. I always do the fuzzy side on the plane. I added my FAA info and my contact information. And then I put on a receiver with a gyro in it. That really helps stabilize the plane a lot because it's a little squirrely. It's a great indoor flyer, and I really enjoyed the build, but I really do enjoy flying the plane. It is fun, and I hope you enjoy it too.